Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Gyo Kim. During his first address to a joint session of the U.S. Congress, President Joe Biden said North Korea's nuclear programs presents a serious threat to the security of the U.S. and of the world. And he reiterated the U.S. will be working closely with the allies to address the North Korean threat. In Washington, human rights groups held an event calling to action for the human rights of the North Korean people. And later this month, President Biden will meet South Korean President Moon Jae-in in their first summit. Today we'll discuss these and more. Joining me is Sandra Fahy, Associate Professor in Global Studies at Sophia University in Japan. Formerly visiting fellow at the Human Rights Program at Harvard Law School, Dr. Fahy is the author of Marching Through Suffering, Loss, and Survival in North Korea. Sung-yoon Lee also joins me today. He is Professor of Korean Studies and Assistant Professor at the Plechaschool of Law and Diplomacy, Tufts University. Professor Lee is also a faculty associate at the program on U.S.-Japan Relations, Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, Harvard University. Good to have you with us today.
Thank you.
Great to be with you.
First of all, Dr. Fahy, President Biden, during his speech to Congress, mentioned North Korea. It was short but firm. What does it think about the statement?
Well, if I may, I'd like to quote what he said. He said, we can also cooperate when it's in our mutual interests, as we did when we extended the New START Treaty on nuclear arms. This is what he was mentioning, and working on climate crisis. And then he says, on Iran and North Korea's nuclear programs that present a serious threat to America's security and world security, we will be working closely with our allies to address the threats posed by both of these countries through diplomacy and stern deterrence. So my first thought on this really is that North Korea's nuclear program has now developed kind of leaps and bounds in the last 10 years, and it could really stand alone in terms of reference to Iran. And I know other scholars have mentioned this. But the second thing is that I think that, but while I'm appreciative that Biden is mentioning this, I think he missed a trick, because when he talks about the threat to world security, he really needs to link in, or he really missed an opportunity to link in the fact that nuclear weapons pose a threat to our existential state of being. If North Korea were to set off even one nuclear weapon, the consequences for us in the immediate and in the long term would be absolutely catastrophic globally. So it really encompasses all issues related to national security, but also basic human rights and human well-being. So I find it interesting that he didn't mention that.
All right. What about you, Professor Lee? What did you make of this statement?
Well, it was a brief statement, as Professor Fahy mentioned, and as we know, but the expression stern deterrence suggests that there will be, for now, implementation of sanctions enforcement, financial pressure under the previous administration in the United States, known as maximum pressure campaign. But it's not an aberration or deviation from what we've seen before, what President Biden mentioned. We just remember slogans like maximum pressure or CVID, complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement of North Korea's nuclear weapons, which was a phrase used under the George W. Bush administration. But in addition to maximum pressure, there was also diplomacy, there was also military deterrence under the Trump administration. So I see this statement as a reaffirmation of deterring North Korea with conventional military force, and also putting maximum financial pressure on North Korea for the time being until North Korea changes its ways.
Mm-hmm. President Biden also restated the U.S. will work closely with the allies to address the North Korean threat. Professor Lee, how aligned is the U.S. with South Korea and Japan on this so far?
Well, in varying degrees. I think Japan and the United States are basically on the same page, although the abductee issue, the problem of North Korea's abduction of Japanese national civilians in the 1970s and 80s remains an unresolved issue and a very thorny, sensitive one for the Japanese government and public. The United States may be more keen on seeking some kind of a diplomatic breakthrough with North Korea without stressing the abductee issue too much. But basically, the two nations are on the same page. Whereas I think there is a divergence of views between Seoul and Washington. We know South Korea is very keen on improving relations with North Korea, making many concessions upfront, lifting sanctions, providing economic aid to North Korea. And the United States feels that is not the wisest approach to the North Korea problem.
Dr. Fahy, what's your thought on the U.S. keeps stressing the alliance with Japan and South Korea?
Well, the alliance between the US and Japan, I think, is very strong. Japan has expressed its close friendship with the United States over the last few months, so that's very important. I think that the alliance is quite key because North Korea has always tried and continues to try to break the alliance. Basically, they've made progress in this with the South Koreans. North Korea wants always to deal with the US directly, one-on-one, because in that way they can delay and continue their strategy. But if the US turns to the alliance, then there is greater pressure on North Korea. And as we know, North Korea's main agenda is, in my assessment, to break the alliance and to reunify the peninsula under the Kim family. So any way that they can break the close ties between South Korea and the United States is their main goal in that agenda setting.
Dr. Fahy, recently South Korea's President Moon Jae-in repeatedly expressed his hope for the resumption of the U.S.-North Korea talks, not only in his recent interview with the New York Times, but also in his cabinet meeting. Do you think this is something acceptable for President Biden?
One-on-one direct talks between the United States and North Korea, I think, is not so advisable. I think that there needs to be a multi-level and multi-alliance talk with North Korea. I think there can be a lot of miscommunication. I don't think it's advisable what Moon was suggesting, actually, particularly because I think Moon is speaking not from the interests of South Korea, but really from the interests of North Korea, which is that it wants to deal directly with the United States.
Professor Lee, what's your observation on this?
I see a danger, the risk of a diplomatic debacle, disaster coming up. Why? Because we've seen it before under similar circumstances 20 years ago. On March 7th, 2001, South Korean President Kim Dae-jung, riding high from winning the Nobel Peace Prize for having met with the North Korean leader back in June 2000, tried to lecture to the new US President, George W. Bush, explaining to President Bush the virtues of his sunshine policy, so-called unconditional engagement, unconditional aid to North Korea. Very few people, virtually no one, I don't know, above the age of 10, enjoys being lectured to unless you're sitting in a lecture hall on your own volition. So if President Moon tries to teach President Biden what is right, what is the correct approach to North Korea, that we have to make concessions, that we have to reach out to the highest level of the North Korean state, Kim Jong-un, do those very flashy summit pageantry as Kim Jong-un did with Biden's predecessor, I don't think that will be very well received by President Biden.
Professor Lee, President Biden earlier said he's open to diplomacy with North Korea when the end goal is denuclearization. Do you think President Biden will reconfirm his stance when he meets President Moon?
Yeah, I mean, that's the right thing to say, which President Biden made that statement during his first press conference back in March. President Moon's approach is, well, Kim Jong-un has told me personally that he is keen on denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, which means something entirely different in the North Korean lexicon. It means the abrogation of the US-South Korea military treaty, the withdrawal of US troops, and all strategic assets from the region, including Japan. So for President Moon to keep insisting that we can trust Kim Jong-un, without any evidence, without any main concessions made by the Kim regime, I don't think that message really will resonate in the Biden White House.
Dr. Fahy, what's your thought on this?
Well, I completely agree with Professor Lee. So there's a lot of evidence that we cannot trust North Korea, that in fact, what they do want, their raison d'etre is to reunify the peninsula under the Kim family, and their nuclear weapons program is the main means to do that. So I think that whether it's Moon Jae-in is willfully ignorant or he's acquiescing to North Korea knowingly, it's just quite unusual to me that he would believe that he could negotiate with the Kim family.
Professor Lee, what would be the priority for President Biden when he meets President Moon Jae-in?
Well, one priority is the ongoing tension spat between South Korea and Japan. And this is sort of a perennial problem in the bilateral relationship between the two virtual allies by virtue of both Japan and South Korea being the linchpin of the US-led alliance system in Northeast Asia. Of course, there's history clouding over the bilateral relationship between Seoul and Tokyo. And while I would not say the relationship today is at its nadir, the lowest point, it's still pretty close to it. So that's one priority for the new Biden administration. I think there is a good chance that President Biden may bring up human rights, North Korea human rights abuses in his meeting with President Moon, the need to raise awareness, the need to support efforts to disseminate more information into North Korea. Perhaps I'm being a bit overly optimistic, but the State Department last week issued a powerful, pithy statement standing with the people of North Korea, the more than 100,000 political prisoners in the regime's state political prisons. Also, the statement mentioned the importance of providing the North Korean people with independent information, and also mentioned that the United States honors North Korean defectors and the human rights community that continue to shine a spotlight on North Korea's egregious crimes, abuses. So we'll see, but we do know that the Biden administration has stated repeatedly that North Korea human rights is a priority.
In fact, there's many ways to see that the nuclear matter is in fact connected with human rights. Victor Cha has written about the link between overseas workers, North Korea's illicit programs, and its nuclear weapons program. And in fact, as I mentioned earlier, the use of a single nuclear weapon nowadays would cause catastrophic difficulty for all of humanity. So I worry that Biden will only bring up the nuclear issue, but I think that it would be better and more conscionable if he were to bring up the human rights issue and mention the fact that Moon has 25 million North Koreans to whom he is accountable by virtue of being a human being, but also because of the trust that the South Korean people have put in him by electing him to office. And of course, as we know, with COVID-19, the human rights situation in North Korea has become increasingly worse with crackdowns on the border and everything else. So my hope would be that Biden would identify the human rights issue first and foremost.
But Dr. Fahy, during the last 3 months, the Biden administration has been emphasizing the importance of human rights issue in its diplomacy. Don't you think the same will apply to the North Korean issue?
Well, I hope he will. It's interesting. My own experience speaking with people in the U.S. government in Washington, D.C. is that they stress the nuclear issue because they feel that it's more important. But I mean, I think they will get more accomplished with North Korea, interestingly, if they were to push on the human rights issue.
Mm-hmm. The State Department's statement that Professor Lee mentioned, it was released on the occasion of the North Korea Freedom Week, which is devoted to promoting the freedom and human rights of North Koreans. And the event was organized both in Washington and in Seoul. The main focus for the activists and defectors who participated in the event was the free flow of information into North Korea. Dr. Fahy, is this mirroring the recent controversy over South Korea's law banning anti-Pyongyang leaflets?
Moon Jae-in, his administration has made it illegal to basically send any information of any sort, including objects, into North Korea. So to me, this is, this gag law is in keeping with North Korea's desires and is basically making the entire peninsula like North Korea in terms of its lack of freedom of information and freedom of expression. So that's quite interesting to reflect on, that they've in fact almost unified the peninsula in that respect. The access to information that North Koreans need and are entitled to just by virtue of being human is something that we absolutely must push. It's the fact that North Koreans have no ability to contextualize and compare and reflect on their experiences, their lived experiences, and the rest of the world.
All right. When talking about the North Korean human rights issue, South Korea seems to be more focused on the humanitarian assistance to North Korea. Professor Lee, South Korea continues to call for easing sanctions on North Korea as a way to provide North Korea with humanitarian aid. But the US government maintains it is the North Korean regime that is blocking the humanitarian aid. Why are Washington and Seoul looking at this issue so differently?
Well, South Korea keeps using this hollow argument that economic rights of the North Korean people supersede political rights, that when you are hungry, when you need medicine, those things take priority. Of course, intuitively, everyone understands that. I do too. When I was growing up in South Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world. I saw abject poverty everywhere. And to a hungry child, to a child who needs medicine urgently, what use are political rights? The Enlightenment thinkers reading about liberalism and the right to exercise your free speech. But none of that applies to North Korea, because in North Korea, every newborn is thrust into an insidious political caste system, political class system. So once you are born a victim of political discrimination, that hangs over you for your entire life.
I can just jump in there for a minute, if it's okay, Liz.
Yeah, go ahead.
Professor Lee talking about South Korea being one of the poorest countries in the world when he was growing up. South Korea moved from being an aid-receiving country to an aid-giving country. And South Korea gives a tremendous amount of aid, including tremendous amount of aid to North Korea. The basic fact is this: North Korea needs humanitarian aid because of its government. The people of North Korea would be able to provide for themselves, would be able to alter their access to food, to employment, to living in different parts of the country, to migrating in and out of the country, to, doing all kinds of things if the government would only, get off their neck. That's why they need humanitarian aid. So in many ways, although I am in support of humanitarian aid that's right-based and carefully monitored, it wouldn't be needed by the North Korean people if the government weren't restricting their rights so extremely.
Mm-hmm. Professor Lee, you earlier said that you expect President Biden to bring up the North Korean human rights issue when he meets President Moon Jae-in. And judging from recent statements from the US government, the Biden administration appears to be putting some emphasis on the North Korean human rights issue. Do you believe the Biden administration will prioritize the human rights issue in its policy and future negotiations with North Korea?
I think for now, that is the intention on the part of the Biden administration. But I do actually share Professor Fahy's skepticism. Why? Because we've seen previous US administrations highlight North Korea's human rights abuses and then really brush it under the rug. George W. Bush was the first US president to take serious interest in the North Korea human rights issue. He graciously met with various North Korean defectors, as well as family members of Japanese abductees in the White House several times. However, when North Korea escalated with its first nuclear test in 2006, there was no more talk of North Korea human rights. There were many concessions given away to North Korea. Same with the Obama years, no real direct address of North Korea's human rights violations. And we must remember President Trump, in the first year in office in 2017, throughout North Korea's year-long bluster barrage, spoke of human rights several times. In fact, Trump gave a stirring speech to the South Korean National Assembly during his first visit to South Korea in November 2017, highlighting North Korea's human rights abuses. But after he fell for the elaborate trap that Kim Jong-un had laid for him, summoning him to a summit in Singapore, after that meeting with Kim Jong-un, President Trump actively defended North Korea, saying, oh yes, it's rough over there, but it's rough everywhere. So while I don't expect that kind of dramatic turn on the part of the Biden administration, it all depends on what North Korea does. If North Korea becomes a growing headache for the Biden administration, there is always the possibility that human rights will be sidelined once again. But for now, the administration is striking the right note.
All right. Well, the first summit between President Biden and President Moon is set to take place on May 21st. As North Korea would be high on the agenda, we'll have to wait and see whether the summit will successfully serve as an opportunity for the two allies to be fully in sync. Dr. Fahy and Professor Lee, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.